Welcome to this week's episode of the Spinoza Triad, where John Gibbs, Dan Rowland, and Dr. Richard Miller discuss freedom. We try to place freedom within the context of the digital society, as we term it, that is to say social media and the ability to record information. We wonder whether freedom has been enhanced by these developments or decreased. Dan begins by asking a rather unhelpful question, which is what exactly we mean by freedom. This we hadn't particularly considered. As usual, our discussions are unscripted. I hope you enjoy them. We certainly did.
What is freedom? We need to get basics first of all established before we start looking at the modern interpretations of it or So what do we mean by freedom?
Well, that's a good point. That's a good point.
Yeah, having taken all these notes and read all these books, I hadn't actually thought that.
Because it's something.
I've got no idea.
It's something we talk about. We talk about like previous generations talked about God, freedom, this, freedom. Like people used to. We've replaced the word God with freedom. In the 16th century, people talked about the God's will and God's will be done. But often we don't actually understand, or not, that sounds poncy. We don't actually think about what freedom actually means for us. We don't actually define it. There's no parameters to it. And that might be the reason why there's all these debates and discussions and tremendous squabbles and arguments going on in society now, especially which have been fueled by social media.
The distinction between positive and negative freedom.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful distinction, actually. You know, it's associated with Isaiah Berlin, the idea of negative and positive freedom. The best way, to explain that to, say, our listeners to this, negative freedom is a lack of restrictions on what you can do, and positive freedom is the ability for you to fulfill your potential or your desires. So, for instance, if a good way of understanding it is if a disabled person is told they can do and go and where they please, that's fine. That's a negative freedom. They can do and go where they please. But a positive freedom there wouldn't be available if there were no steps and ramps and lifts, or rather, there were too many steps and ramps, no ramps and lifts. So the positive freedom is the freedom to be actually able to fulfill your desires. The negative freedom is simply the absence of obstacles to do as you please. They seem to be in a kind of opposition at times. I mean, in order to fulfill positive freedoms, you have to maybe quite often restrict the negative freedoms. Someone's freedom to be free of gun crime might involve the restriction of someone else's freedom to have a gun. So often negative freedoms are associated with conservative views of a limited government, limited intervention, and positive freedoms with more government action and more liberal views of society.
Yeah.
I mean, there are so many ways of engaging with that, though, isn't it? You could take a sociological position with that, can't you, about what external impositions there are.
Can I be coerced? Do I allow myself to be coerced, and therefore I'm free? So the key question is, which you always hear on LBC and talk shows and that kind of thing, these irate people, shouting, screaming, why should I obey anyone else? Especially with the virus and the pandemic, that's fueled by this concept of freedom. But yeah. I think the concept is a confused one. A lot of people express freedom now in the negative sense, without a system of duties and obligations that you have towards the other and the stranger. So people talking about the lockdown measures and always talking about freedom and going out in the street and demanding freedom are forgetting the second half of the equation, which freedom only exists because of your duties towards the other. Right. So you don't hear them talking about that. So in the modern sense, I kind of think that's kind of missing.
What do you mean by duty to the other, though? I know ethically that is it an inherent condition of freedom to have some duty to an other?
Well, that's the debate.
Or should you? Is it is or an ought? Isn't it?
I think when you start talking about freedom in a philosophical way, you've got those three questions. Why should I obey anyone else? Why should I not live as I like? Why must I obey? And do I choose to be coerced? Into those things, you've got an obligation towards the other, because you're choosing. In order for you to be free, you're choosing to give up some of your own freedoms.
Well, that is that's one of the great paradoxes of freedom, isn't it? It's the Rousseau idea of forcing someone to be free. You can take someone's right to have a gun away to make us all free from gun violence. You can take away my right to not wear a seatbelt because my freedom to not wear a seatbelt restricts your freedom to have resources in the NHS spent wisely or whatever. So, the responsibility to others is a sort of collect. But it's interesting what you said right at the beginning, Dan, is that lots of us don't really think about this. We all think we feel and know, and it's become a mantra. As you said, almost like a religious free.
Yes,
We must be
sacred.
free.
In this profane world, we live in a profane world, but this is a sacred thing. So we hold it up, freedom and the NHS. These are the only things which we hold dear now, but we don't quite know what we mean by it.
It's that common cry that people used to say, well, it's a free society, ain't it? It's kind of, people used to say that when I was at school anyway. It's a free society, ain't it? Like someone would do something absolutely disgusing, like spit on the pavement or something. And you say, oh, you dirty bugger.
Litter,
and drop bug on. They say it's a free society, isn't it? But I think you can distinguish there between the complicated analysis of freedom, which is where we're going. I don't want to sound elitist here, but where we are going, and the everyday freedom, the sort of vulgar freedom. Like vulgar patriotism is like flags and Union Jacks and stuff. Vulgar ideas of freedom is do as you please. Well, that's no concept of freedom can possibly be do as you please.
But that's anarchy. That's nothing to do with politics. That's apolitical. It's saying let's not have any political structures. Let's not have any restrictions. If you want to create a political idea, a political society, that has to involve restrictions.
Absolutely.
So these people are wanting to live in a society free of people. So the only place where you'll be truly free is when you're dead. when you don't have to interact with anyone.
I'm looking forward to that, actually.
Oh, goody, yes.
At last, those are going to be my last words. At last.
A bit of peace.
A bit of bloody peace. Talked a while ago about Ayn Rand. Robert knows it. The concept of the kind of night watchman state, the minimal state. You're pretty much free to do anything as long as the harm. Is it the harm principle? Is it?
Yeah, John Stuart Mill.
John Stuart Mill's harm principle. As long as you're not harming somebody else, then you have a zone of freedom within that to do as you please.
But then that harming is such a broad area.
If you go into Tesco's and you'll buy your coffee from not a fair trade place, your actions, he would say, could be, that's a secondary harm, not actually a direct harm. So it does depend on the definition of harm with liberal kind of arguments.
Absolutely.
I wonder what you said earlier with the freedom, though. I remember saw a discussion once. I think it was Badiou. You even wrote a book on this, St. Paul. It's actually called that, and it's about this very thing we're talking about. I just don't remember very well off the top of my head the arguments that he makes. Talking about St. Paul, in that he talked about before the law there was no law, and he's basically talking about the way in which by bringing into the law you bring in the transgressions to the law. So there was no sin before there was the law. The very imposition of the law itself brings in its own transgressions. So the act of freedom is almost psychopathic in some respects because it demands everything.
Yeah, the book you're referring to there, Richard, is St. Paul: The Foundations of Universalism by Alain Badiou. That's the French philosopher Badiou, Badiou. I've just Googled this, by the way, so I'm not claiming I remember this off the top of my head, but Badiou's book reframes or reconstructs or takes a different view of St. Paul as not just as one of the founding fathers of the Christian church, but the Christian religion or the Catholic Church, but also as a radical revolutionary figure, since he extrapolates quite sensibly, really, that a universalist idea of God, that God is somehow able to reach out to every individual, empowers every individual in a radically liberal kind of way, which could be seen as anarchic. In other words, Christianity is the Christ of turning over the tables in the temple. It's where the individual can be seen as having a sort of bat line, as it were, directly to the guy upstairs. And in this sense, every individual is liberated. Who's to tell me what to do if I am directly in contact with God? In this sense, it's anarchic, as Richard, as you point out, and a universalist view and a universalist relationship with God could underpin views of the universal nature of freedom, the universal nature of individualism, right the way till today. So that, in other words, you can appropriate individualist universal Christianity for both a left, a radical left, and a radical right. form of revolutionary thought. Which reminds me to plug the website which accompanies the Spinoza Triad now. So if you wish to look up links to Alain Badiou or other links to any other authors or references we make in our podcast now, please follow the link on the podcast to the website which accompanies this and hopefully helps to explain some of the things we talk about and some of the ideas that pop up in our minds.
If we had a society of psychopaths, nobody would be free. It'd be like that awful series, The Purge. Nobody would be free. You could then say, you could have a very limited positive view of freedom by saying I'm free and behind my locked doors and my gate.
That's overlaying ethics onto that, though, isn't it? I think.
Yeah, and it also is overlaying.
I don't think you can detach ethics from freedom. It's not like it's not a natural thing. It's a human construct. Nobody's naturally free, because if they are, which is what the people who talk about freedom are always talking about, the natural state of man, it'll be a state of anarchy.
But isn't that
nasty, brutish?
I was about to say, isn't that that's a Hobbesian view, isn't it? That's man in his natural state is all nasty, brutish, and short. The war of all against all.
No, I'm thinking can you detach ethics from freedom?
Well, freedom, whichever concept of freedom you have, it's an ethical concept. Whether you think it's right for people to be left alone to be ruggedly individual, that's an ethical decision about the nature of human beings and how they should live. And if you think we're freer when we're cooperative and collective under a state of rule and law, then that's also an ethical choice. I mean, the discussion of freedom is an ethical discussion.
Unless you think of it in terms of almost like a drive, though, pure freedom. I don't know what that would look like. Like you say, it would be committing negative freedoms on others, though, wouldn't it?
The answer to Hobbes is Rousseau. That man in his natural state is actually quite okay, and it's only society that starts to impose. Man is born free, but he's everywhere in chains. So you've got it's only as soon as you start introducing society and concepts of property owning, and in fact rules themselves start to inhibit mankind. So you start becoming jealous of your neighbour, or you start fearing you haven't got enough of something. So society then produces the kind of animalistic, grotesque person that we're then afraid of, because we assume that would only be worse if we were free.
But then, but then the trouble with Rousseau is he's then saying a kind of an elite would have to decide what freedom is and then force people to be free. So there's a sense of coercion, because it's kind of a view that, the average person doesn't quite know what's best for them. Yes. But we're going to create a society that will bring out the best in everyone. Therefore, coercion equals freedom, which becomes a difficult equation to square there.
It is difficult. Coercion equals freedom. You're right. But then again, what's the difference between coercion equals freedom and an acceptance that there should be rules or there should be fairness? Or the moment you start talking about rules and fairness, we're going to start coercing people.
Yeah, fair point.
It's inevitable.
Yeah, so we live in a rules-based society. We're all following Rousseau's social contract.
Yeah. Whether we think that in a natural state we'd all be wandering in the woods happily picking flowers, or whether we'd be ravaging each other like mad beasts, whatever we believe, we still sort of think that there should be some kind of Leviathan.
Yeah, point's an important one then, because Richard's trying to say, well, what is the natural state of man? And that's the key question. If we are going to be picking flowers together and smiling for all eternity, then obviously, we don't need rules. But because we do need rules, perhaps it is a Hobbesian view of nature that we essentially have. And I think Richard was about to say something about the psychology of it, saying it's almost like a natural thing, the idea of freedom.
There's a couple of things there. I mean, there's definitely the philosophy and psychology and stuff we've talked about before, where you've got this underpinning thing that limits your freedom, whether or not it's the Freudian id or Hegel's Night of the World, or these other arguments we've talked about in other podcasts. I mean, just on a kind of political level of freedom, I was thinking about the Hegel stuff we did on the other podcast when I was reading that, I think I mentioned it on there, that determinant negation opposites, where freedom by its own logic becomes authoritarianism if we have to imply freedom on everyone. It's two sides of the same coin almost. It threw me a bit, that, Dan, because when we said about doing this one on freedom, and I've been looking at stuff around technology and
Dan, you very unhelpfully started with a fundamental definition that we should have considered. That was really...
Well, sorry. Yeah.
Because when you said that, I had that voice in my head thinking, I've actually got no idea. I haven't
Which I
thought
think
about this
is the
once.
point. Rich, that's the point. That's the point.
Yeah.
We don't think we use it all the time. We don't know what we're talking.
Slightly worryingly, if I admit it, in the back of my head when I keep saying the word freedom over and over again, I get Mel Gibson was William Wallace punching the air.
As you start to construct rules, and as you become, as society organizes itself in a way, as you start to construct rules, so you start to define those things that might have once been considered unconsidered. In fact, you start defining areas of transgression. So one of the reasons there's a lot more crime, an argument goes, is because there are a lot more laws.
Yes, yeah, that's the point, I think, isn't it?
So we produce more areas of transgression, and therefore produce more limits on our freedom by trying to define how to behave. It doesn't the digital age just produce a massive area of control of which we can now transgress. We can now transgress in our own individual lives or see myself digitally. There's a digitization of the world which Foucault idea of that he takes from Bentham of the panopticon, and the idea of the discourse of control and discipline and punish, in which he uses the metaphor of Bentham's panopticon, the perfect designed prison where everyone believes themselves to be observed, therefore they don't know whether you don't know whether you're being observed, but you believe yourself to be observed. In the digital age, as laws define behaviors as transgressive, so the increasing digitization of our world has defined all sorts of ways in which we can now measure, for instance, us as educators, as it were. What's happened to education in our teaching lifetimes is that it's become increasingly dataized. So we can now see all sorts of ways in which we transgress that we didn't know. Everything from the progress over so many levels of progress that students are supposed to achieve over a certain period of time. And students can now see how they are digitized into a level of progression or not progression. It can be monitored and so out in society we've become a kind of surveillance capitalist society.
That's like probably occurring in China right now. The idea of surveillance capitalism.
I think it's happening everywhere, though, isn't it?
I'd say yes. I think the Chinese have just taken it into an area of sort of almost logical manifesting it, like the Hobbesian Leviathan. The Chinese are going to be that because they believe that anything else is Tiananmen Square and chaos. So they're going to control society. Whereas we're allowing it to be privatized. Mass, corporations and the marketplace have created a sort of surveillance capitalism, which is reframing what we are as individuals because we believe ourselves to continue not only being watched but watching ourselves.
I mean, could you also say that we're also privatizing ourselves as well, to the point that we don't feel we have any relationship really with the other, going back to your earlier point I made. So the idea of the old stuff of political freedom starts to dissipate and disappear because people don't feel that they have anything to identify with that's not directly related to themselves.
I think you can link both what you both just said there together. And I'm going to go from yesterday when I was at work, I had my headphones in and I was listening to Neil Postman's book, which I mentioned to you, John. I mean, it's absolutely brilliant. It was written in the early 90s, and it's as relevant now as it was. I think probably more so. And in that, he talks about, I think the first essay was marked in Cambridge. He talks about the way in which essays were marked. It was the first time a kind of quantitative outcome was given for knowledge. Something's written down and it's worth this, it has a certain grade. And he then goes on to trace about the printing press, and he talks about education. And he describes how acquisition of knowledge now becomes correlated to a numerical outcome. And if you think, basically, all forms of social life now, well, not all, but a lot, don't they, with work, with targets, with education, with health, with everything has some sort of numerical outcome to it. And his point is as things become more digitalized, they lose their context and don't have the same meaning as they used to have, which kind of links into what you're saying there, Dan. Yeah. The meaning is lost because it isn't contextualized properly. And he says the issue then becomes where you use technology itself to try and get yourself out of this massive increase in information. And the information is digitalized. And how do you do that? And I was thinking, really, since Postman wrote that, he could never have foreseen phones and everything else. The way our culture has dealt with this, and it's a culture which has been determined by the technology itself. How do we deal with that? Well, we just get more and more used to shorter and shorter pieces of information because there is so much information. We look for summaries of everything, shortened down. Instagram is one minute videos. Twitter allows only a certain amount of a word count. Students in school don't want to read anything really in any depth. They just want summaries. Everything, our engagement with information become a collection of summaries. I listened to the week before at work, actually, with my, again, headphones on, Mark Fisher. In that one, he was explaining to a student, he worked in a FE college, and the guy was asking to summarize Nietzsche. And he said, you can't summarize it, because the truth of Nietzsche is in the very difficult nature of his writing. You have to be in it to read it, to try and grapple with it. And I wonder if maybe that's the part that's lost. I mean, I can't recommend that Postman book enough.
To that, that's really interesting, Richard. Do you think there's a possibility that we've stopped asking questions? So we kind of agree. We kind of agree as a society in this digital age, as you call it, John, that there's no more questions to ask. So it's almost like everything's agreed. We kind of know where we're going, which is but everything is digitized. So everything
is digitalized and shortened, but it has to be that way. That's the technological.
But that's what I'm saying. It has to be that way because we've decided that all mystery and questions of metaphysics need to be thrown in the bin because they can't be measured. So things which are only valuable now are things which are measured and can be turned into data.
But value isn't truth. Value is belief. If you like, you said. I liked at the beginning when you said God is now freedom. We look like that, and almost like the way in which we approach that element of freedom is through belief, not truth. We have to believe the same thing. It's a weird kind of polarizing view. You mentioned identity politics, whatever. It's not really about the identity politics, is it? It's about the perceived way in which I should have the right to believe anything and say anything I want, versus no, you should agree with me.
Any restrictions on belief is seen as a restriction on freedom.
Yes, it's belief. Belief is the new economy of freedom.
Okay, that's interesting.
The one thing that strikes me there about that is that you're right. It is not only is it. I was trying to search for the word fetishizing earlier. That freedom has become a fetish, a kind of religious magic word that people rely on. But also looking at Neil Postman, and Neil Postman is drawing on Marshall McLuhan, and Marshall McLuhan's idea that in the age of print, in the age before print, people thought about ideas narratively and verbally. And in the age of print, people thought about the world in a print form. And in the age of digital, people think sort of digitally about
images.
So the medium is the message, and it shapes the way you think about the world. So thought is shaped. In a television age, people think televisually. Well, so in this age, we think about things in a way that can be YouTubeized or internetized, so that it becomes simple, summarized, bullet pointed, and as you articulate, it's a kind of accepted background truth, which is nothing can change, and this is the world the way it is. So,
John, that's
curiously, we've got bags and bags of information, and we seem to understand lots and lots of things, but we don't look. But we don't really understand. We're simply comprehending without understanding. John,
John,
no, go on.
Can I just say what you just said there? That's what I was trying to say earlier. Do you think that there is this agreement, almost like living in a communist system on the other political scale, that there's a total agreement about where things are going, and so there's no discussion about a possible alternative future? We don't ask these difficult questions about what is freedom, because it's all sewn up and just become entirely technical, which sits in nicely with the data stuff. And so, big political discussions, there's no arguments left anymore. So it's people just tidying up the edges of society.
And the data and the internet become the new clergy. We reverted to a pre-Renaissance age in which we're back in the medieval world, in which instead of the priests speaking in Latin, now they speak in incomprehensible data processing.
They speak in binary.
In binary. They speak in binary.
And that.
I mean, in terms of freedom, I guess what we're describing really is a largely kind of postmodern technological culture. Zizek talks about the removal of the authority. Here's that lovely example. He says, the difference between authority, again, limiting freedom, what it used to do to now. So he says, on a Sunday when you're young, the authoritative father says, you're going to see your grandma. And there's no ifs or buts, you're going. right? So and it's kind of like quite liberating, because there's no option. You go and see grandma. He said, whereas nowadays, this kind of the old, again, it's that idea, the incredulity to the meta narrative, the old big stories we used to understand ourselves by, class, gender, the old sociological structures. He says now, on a Sunday, rather than that, the postmodern authority says, you know your mother loves you very much, and she won't be here forever, and wouldn't it be nice if you went and saw her? And so like now more than ever, you want to go and see her, and there's this kind of underlying almost paranoia in the way in which we regulate ourselves.
The authoritarian father, it gives you a certain sense of freedom, because yes, you have to go along and sit there through the boring meeting with your grandma, and he says you've just got to do it, but you have the freedom to decide what you're going to think while you're there. You might be thinking about going fishing or doing something else whilst talking to your grandma, whereas the second one, the more pernicious friendly father or the friendly boss, is almost directing your thoughts as well as your action. Yeah, and a lot of society today is very passive aggressive, and it is, even as we're all teachers or previous teachers, you've got the modern management of education, which adopts this very positive language, which when I started teaching management, you say, look, we just got to get on with this. It's a bit of a pain in the arse, we've got to do it. But now there's kind of this softly spoken, friendly boss, which is much more dishonest than the authoritative father, because they're saying, we want you to feel positive about your work. We want to feel excited about your work. That word excited is overused in corporate language, and also being on a journey, and this enforcement that we're all doing something together. We're all on a journey together. All this kind of language is very similar to what Zizek's friendly, in inverted commas, father is saying. The liberal father, the controlling than the authoritative father.
And as I say, I think to myself, goodness me, how saturated schools are, and indeed our society, with passive aggression
Absolutely.
and manipulation. We live in a nudge, psychologically manipulative culture, whether it comes from advertising.
Yes.
In the days of the hidden persuaders, Vance Packard's hidden persuaders, or in the school, when you turn to a class these days and say, do your homework or you get a detention, or you imply that somehow their lives will be ruined. You need to be working to get on. You're at school now to build your identity. It must be terrible pressure.
But it's not. But it's like what Richard said and what Zizek says. It's not honest, because really it's not about the child and their future. It's about control.
Absolutely.
So if you have a person's thoughts under control over one idea, i.e. in this kind of just becoming a consumer, and if it's also the subject of this podcast, if you couch that kind of control in the language of freedom, then people are coerced while they think they're free.
That is wonderful. I think you're absolutely right. I think coerced by the suggestion of freedom and the dishonesty of it. I mean, I was thinking of a lovely sketch once where it might have been Mitchell and Webb, and the sketch is there's a teacher in the classroom, and there's a kid, and he's leaning across the table, and he's saying, well, Stephen, you know you can do this, Stephen. You just got to believe in yourself, and you've really, because you know that in here, and the bell goes. The teacher goes, right, gets his newspaper out. The kid goes, yeah, you were saying? He goes, break time, piss off. The mask slips. It's so much, the caring, the considerate, the self-fulfilling nature that we are all implored to have. You must live, you must do the best for you. There's a lot of dishonest, I think it's more overt in advertising, but I bet it's absolutely true in education.
There's another point on this one. It's a compulsion to enjoy as well, because this is another point as part of that same argument that he makes, where you are regulating ourselves continually. It's a bit Foucauldian, but there's that regulation. Well, we're just self-regulated continually. That's what you're saying, Dan, isn't it?
The voice of the friendly boss is internalized.
It's your voice, isn't it?
Then you think you're being free, but you're being coerced.
How does an individual do that? The arguments there around consumption, then, that we then try and fill up what it is we feel we're missing through consumption and buying things, and you buy into the objects of postmodern culture, become almost partial insofar as you're no longer buying an object for its aesthetic or its usefulness in the one thing. You're buying an object that has with it an experience that's coupled with it. So it's not enough. I mean, you mentioned the other week, John, about that Zizek sketch with the cup of coffee. You know, it's not enough to have the cup of coffee. The cup of coffee, as you sit there in Starbucks, has a whole identity that goes with it. And you can make the argument really that the selves off the shelves argument, where we construct our own identities, are coupled with this almost extreme paranoia to try and become something through these objects which are partial. They are void of their essence. They're what makes them them. So like beer without alcohol, coffee without caffeine. You have to engage in all these things, but there's a gap between the actual pure essence of the thing. We're mediated from it all the time, but at the same time constantly consuming. Vaping.
Smoking without the smoke.
But there's a backlash against that, because then Zizek makes the argument, search for the real, or what he means is that then you find it like extreme sports. People go and do things to try and get in touch with everything from Ironman competitions to MMA. He even uses in one of the books the example of cutters, sort of self-harming. He uses an interview where somebody that was doing this themselves said they do it just to feel alive, just to feel themselves again. Because his point is, in this sort of society we're in, the actual essence of everything's been removed, sanitized, given back to us. And because of this desire to consume, to become subject.
And that's the reason it's there. So consumption is coercion. Is that what you're arguing?
Yeah.
But it's expressed as freedom. So everyone laps it up.
Yeah, that's the point. Yeah, it's not freedom.
And I cannot be free in any other way except going to IKEA or going to Argos.
Yeah.
And
that's the point. You go to IKEA and you buy into this experience. It's not the object. It's the experience of the consumption and having the thing there, giving a version of a lifestyle, if you like.
And it brings us full circle the way to what we said at the beginning about what is actual freedom and the desirability of freedom. Before, Dan, you joined us, when you were struggling to make your way through the ether, I said to Richard that, what time can you do the podcast? I said, well, I'm off to all day today, but I'm free the rest of the day. And I quipped that I was, unless freedom's an illusion, to which Richard said, well, unless the illusion is freedom. And I thought, well, of course that is in a sense. Yeah. Is it true that our society has been extraordinarily successful at manufacturing the illusion of freedom?
To an extent, definitely.
It's quite tyrannous, really. But maybe it's an illusion that we all welcome, because don't we love the idea of being free? I mean, it's an extraordinarily desirable thing to feel, even though it's an illusion, even though I'm not free in most of what I do in my life.
Could I say perhaps that's why when we started this podcast and we said, well, what is freedom? Because it's an illusion and doesn't quite exist and it's been emptied out of any real meaning. That's why nobody ever asks, what do we mean by freedom? Nobody talks about freedom in a philosophical or political sense anymore. They tend to see it as something which is very individual and personal. So we're administering it, like I said earlier, with no arguments, no discussions anymore.
Yeah, but then while it's an illusion, it's a very incredibly powerful one. I recently watched that wonderful documentary film about the First World War soldiers. It wasn't a documentary; it was the recreation. The guy that did Lord of the Rings, he took a series of First World War films and then digitized them to make them
coloured ones,
coloured them in and everything. So they're moving, and then added a bit of sound effects in the background so you can see. And I thought to myself, well, if you said to a soldier in the First World War, what are you fighting for? And what is it you believe in? They'd have had the most profound belief that this was, they were about to go over the top and be certainly killed in a lot of cases or be injured for something they deeply believed: love of country, defense of the realm, fending off the Boche. All of those things, though, were largely illusions. There was no threat to Britain in the First World War. National identity, people think of themselves as English and British. You can be lots of beliefs that are pure idiocy, but people will die for them or commit violence for them. Well, freedom may be an illusion. It's a very, very beautiful and powerful illusion. Don't we want to believe?
Now, in the modern world, in this digital world where we don't have religion anymore. We have this capitalist idea of objects and things and experiences, as Richard was outlining. But so we have this thing where everything is agreed. Freedom is an agreement which is unanalyzed, and that's why people aren't, very enamored by big ideas and big thoughts anymore, because everything's sewn up.
Because freedom is always deferred. But how much of our lives are deferred? We live in a very deferred culture, and we're all, next summer, next spring, when I've paid off the mortgage, when I've got enough savings in the bank, when I've achieved this, I'll go on that diet, I'll go to the gym. There's always a series of deferred ways in which I will achieve some sort of freedom, but just out of reach.
That's the psychoanalytic argument that we've chatted about before, about how fantasy or belief, whatever or narration, if you like, keeps you at a distance from the inherent void or failure that is the thing itself. It's
true.
Not there, but the fantasy of the thing keeps it alive. The worst thing you can do is achieve your goals. You get there, and it's like castles made of sand, isn't it? It's after initial fluffy feeling, it's gone. The thing that you work towards, or that gave you the coordinates by which you understood your social world, has collapsed. Human beings, by very nature of being, I say by nature, I don't like using that word, but desire itself can have no end point. You can't arrive at it. It's more of it's always there. I've got another Lacanian joke here with a English Irishman and a Scotsman get a year in jail, and they say you can have one wish when you're in prison, and the Irishman says, I'll have a year's supply, an everlasting supply of Guinness. The Scotsman says, I'll have a year's supply of Scotch, of whiskey, and the Englishman says, I'll have a year's supply of cigarettes, please. And so after a year, they open up the cell, and the Irishman drops out, liver failure, keels over, and then the Scotsman does pretty much the same. And then they open the Englishman's door, and he says, I say, you wouldn't have a light, would you? And the point is that the things that we want, we need to be mediated from, because we can't, achieving them is often the worst thing that can happen to us.
That's interesting.
Yes.
Complete opposite of this would obviously be a kind of Buddhist perspective, which
exactly, totally the opposite.
I don't know what Zizek would say about Buddhism.
I can tell you what he says in the book on belief.
Because the essence of Buddhism is recognizing all that we're talking about and removing yourself. Real Theravada Buddhism, which says that you've got to realize that there is no self, there is no ego, and that nirvana is just a blowing out of everything. At the center of everything, there's a nothing.
In the book on belief, he talks about, it was one of his sort of early 2000s books, and I'm sure in that one he says about it being the ultimate Western capitalist religion, because you enter into this thing of self, as it were, but there is no room there for political action. I'm pretty sure the argument's something like that.
Buddhism says the self doesn't exist; it's an illusion.
But and while you're thinking that and that going on, then inequality is from a kind of Marxist perspective, carries on.
You're not going to find many Marxist Buddhists. Yeah.
No.
I was going to say that
it's not a combination I've heard before.
Yeah, but if a Marxist met a Buddhist, they would.
It sounds like it was in the punchline.
The Marxists would certainly agree that much of society is illusory, and false consciousness was produced.
Of course, that's the whole point of it, isn't it? Yeah.
And then the Buddhists say, but that's only the start of it, mate. The whole of material reality is an illusion.
Yeah. But John Marx believes that the state would just wither away, and that the true history of humanity would then begin when the state vanished and there was proper communist revolution. The communists are trying to replace one thing with another, whereas the Buddhist is just saying, look, there's nothing there at the center. And therefore, that's what will set you free. You'll be entirely happy when you realize the essential nothingness of life.
Yeah.
Yes. As long as exactly. As long as you can reconcile.
It's a bit of a bleak view, but
somewhat bleak view.
That does seem quite releasing and relaxing in a way to say there's. But would it be fulfilling? I don't know. But that's the kind of Buddhist perspective, and is that an answer to what freedom could possibly be. But
it does sound rather like the freedom one's going to achieve naturally anyway, just by dying.
Yeah, it's like a
I think
death.
I've got an appointment with a freedom from myself. Sometime right
That's
about.
What I said. The only way you can be truly free is to be dead.
Sometime in the 2050s, probably, hopefully. Sometime in the 2050s, I should be taking an extended leave from myself. The attractive nature of freedom, and I think human beings don't like the idea. They really do not like the idea that we don't have freedom, or that our lives are deterministic, to get into that philosophical idea. That if you say to someone, are you free? You say, well, I'm certainly free at this moment to raise my hand and touch that cup and knock myself on the head, and all that. And we certainly want to believe that. And it feels intuitively powerful to be free. I'd heard this was actually a sociological study. It wasn't. I don't know if it was a study or just an observation of an old people's home. And in this old people's home of some years ago, I forget where I read this, but they compared different regimes in old people's home. I don't think it was an experiment on the old people. That sounds awful. But it was they compared different regimes, and they found that in a regime where dinner was at 2:00, and on Monday you had sprouts, and on Tuesday you had stew, and on Wednesday you had the tomato soup, and visitors were allowed on Sunday afternoon, and you played bingo on Sunday morning. On a regimented world, people lived a certain amount. There was a certain amount of turnover. People got into their 80s and 90s, and every year they lost a few.
Get bored of this.
Yeah, as you would. And they compared this with homes where they pretty much had a similar routine, but they gave people an illusion of freedom. So they'd say to them, well, do you want tomato soup today, or do you want it tomorrow? Do you want to play bingo, or should we play Ludo? They introduced more freedom, quite absurd kind of levels of not particularly important freedom, but some enough freedom. And people, by a measurable degree, lived longer. In other words, death declined. People put off dying because they could choose whether the tomato soup was on a Monday or a Tuesday. I mean, to put it in its simplest. We enormously value even what is pathetic levels of choice. We don't like to have that taken away from us.
But there's the flip side to that as well, isn't it? I mean, isn't the whole kind of existential argument is about, it's existential fear of absolute freedom, isn't it? If you have too much choice, it's almost that in itself is almost traumatic. I mean, that was Sartre's argument, wasn't it? I mean, I remember hearing an interview with, is his name not Ferriss? Tim Ferriss, is it? The guy that wrote 4 Hour Work Week and 4 Hour. He's a really interesting guy, and he's really interesting in interviews. So he was obviously a really wealthy guy. He wrote this sort of bestseller, 10 years or so ago, and he sort of jets around the world and gives sort of seminars and this kind of thing. And he got himself a dog. I'm pretty sure it was this. He got himself a dog just because in looking after the dog, I mean, obviously it wasn't the only reason, but one of the main ones is that just having those kinds of choices taken away from you in some part actually made you more happy. That you wake up in the morning, you have certain obligations, like you said at the very beginning, Dan, so some form of, to be happy in your freedom. There is an element of service or ethical balance there as well. Of too much freedom is too much for a human being. Not enough. If you feel you're not getting enough.
It's a curious perception. Paradox is another paradox. You come across a lot of these. Paradox is that people like the idea of freedom, but it often does make you quite miserable. One of those TED talks by a chap talks about the painful nature of our society. He says, there's 150 different kinds of salad dressing in an average supermarket these days, whereas back in the 60s there were 5. And he says replicate that across our society. These high levels of choice are actually quite tyrannizing. And they carried out some sort of experiments where they gave people limited choice or more choice. They were more discomforted by more choice, but they always wanted more choice. So if you offered people, would you like a choice or shall I choose for you? People said, I'll choose, thank you very much.
John, well, the trouble with this, the choice we have now, the freedom of choice, which is another catchphrase in the modern world, is it's all, as Richard was saying, linked around objects and experiences, not about making decisions about how we all live together, which is where the origins of political thought on freedom comes from. How are we all going to get along with each other? But that discussion has now evolved.
But that comes back to what Richard was saying earlier.
Then we express freedom through consumer choice rather than political action.
True consumption, yeah.
So we started off the idea of freedom with, how we're all going to relate towards each other, almost like the American Constitution. How can we all be free, like Rousseau or Mill? So replacing the government of persons by the administration of things. So we're now expressing freedom through the administration of things, i.e. how do we organise our shops to create the best consumer choices? As Richard says, that's not going to make us feel very satisfied as human beings who have...
But Dan, isn't that what all human beings are doing, in a sense? We're all of us on the Titanic. We have to reconcile ourselves as we get older. I mean, the child has to reconcile themselves to the limits of ordinary material existence. So a child thinks Mr. Chair can sit next to Mrs. Chair, and you realise actually some things are alive and some things are dead. And as you get older, you realise in life the material limits of life are replaced by a sense of mortality. And while we're sitting on the Titanic waiting to go down, we're all moving the chairs around, creating some sort of illusion of I can at least control that before.
Well, there's some people starting to think they can start to live forever and they can download their minds. We've got the thing that Richard was saying earlier about the idea that belief is replacing truth. So what you've expressed so eloquently there is that's the truth of life. But we seem to be moving away from a relationship with truth of life to expression of personal belief.
It's not just belief though. I mean, it's belief. It's an agreement of belief. I think it's not enough for me to believe. You have to believe the same as I do. It's the others' access to pleasure. There's something. It's a consensus, and I think it works so efficiently because of, again, I'll go back to technology now. The interconnectedness now of human beings. Giddens' expression, time-space distanciation. You've made it in sociology. You've got to make up a word, but that compression of time and space. So we're all so connected now. It makes this economy of belief so much more powerful than it's ever been. This agreement of belief. So I think that's what we see playing out. I mean, kind of another guy I really recommend having a look at is not. He only is a philosopher, I suppose. Is a Jocko Willink. Have you ever heard of him? Jocko Willink is an American. I think he was a commander in the Navy SEALs, but a really, really interesting guy. And I read a book of his a few years ago, about a year ago. It was it's just called Discipline Equals Freedom. You arrive at freedom from being in charge of yourself. Kind of what you've alluded to earlier, Dan, about but in regards to a certain, a responsibility to yourself, I don't think it's Nietzschean really, but that kind of self-discipline is what will give you freedom. Because if you don't have self-discipline, then you end up in the kind of existential trap of having nothing. And the fear of absolute freedom it generates anxiety, doesn't it? It's an anxious state to be in. It's not a good one. Yeah, which is probably this idea that you can be anything you want. Is probably one of the issues around the increases in problems around mental health that you're seeing. The idea that you can be anything or do anything, but anything, that the problem is in the thing, because there's nothing there is nothing to be. It's full of these sort of empty signifiers that offer partial parts of lifestyle choices that I want to be seen to pursuing some sort of lifestyle or some version of self, which isn't really the kind of freedom that, like, say, Jocko Willink would talk about. Or you see social media. I'm on the fence with social media. I think it has as much good as it does bad, in my experience with it. But it's definitely something. If you allowed yourself to invest in that, and you were constantly looking at the other, as it were, in these short summaries, constantly micro sort of moments of lifestyle choices. It's almost like we're programmed.
Who knows how long these podcasts will sit there, and someone will be listening to them years from now.
Yeah, so posthumously we'll become famous.
There we are. Yeah, we are. Yeah, we've defeated.
It'll be on the grave. Yeah. They were the Spinoza triad.
Yeah, what are now considered a classic.
Yeah. That's it. I've got to do some housework. Yeah. Right, I'll catch up with you soon. That was brilliant. Thanks, John. Take care. Bye. Bye.
You have been listening to the discussions of the Spinoza Triad, John Gibbs, Dr. Richard Miller and Dan Rowland. I hope you enjoyed our discussion today. If you have suggestions for ideas for future discussions, comments, you can record your comments, send them to us by email, follow us on our website, or comment on the Facebook page, which is linked to this site. If you are a regular listener to our discussions, you'll realise that these podcasts appear at somewhat irregular intervals. This is somewhat dependent on our work commitments and our ability to meet together over Zoom. If you record a comment, we hopefully could play it or respond. However, you may wish to be a guest on our show. If you would like to do that, please contact us by email and we can include you in the discussion in future. It is a delight and a surprise that our audience has been steadily growing across this country and around the world. I hope you've enjoyed our discussions, and I hope it won't be too long before we can record another.